Hi there, and welcome to the channel. This is the place where we dive into the life and history of William Shakespeare to look at food, games, crafts, and history tidbits that happened between 1564 and 1616, or thereabouts sometimes. If that sounds like your cup of tea, then hit that like and subscribe button because we're here every week. In Shakespeare's lifetime, apples were a popular food for pies as well as drinks. And if you were walking around in Shakespeare's England, did that mean that you would see rows of cultivated apple orchards? Let's find out right now on That Shakespeare Life. Shakespeare mentions apples in his plays at least 9 times, and the fruit of an apple tree is a popular ingredient in dishes from pies to cider and even beverages for Shakespeare's lifetime. When I realized how prolific apples were in the culture of Shakespeare's time period, I wondered exactly what the landscape of England would have looked like. Were there large commercial orchards by the side of the road, or was everybody just having their own apple trees in their backyard, and that's where they would have sourced these apples? I wondered a lot about how were apples grown in the 16th and 17th century. Well, to find out, I sat down with Nigel and Alison Deacon, who are apple historians living and working in Leicestershire, England, cultivating rare and historic breeds of apples. They're experts on the background of apples and specifically apples in England, so they were the perfect people to ask about this question. Here's what they had to say.
Well, there weren't commercial orchards in the way we mean today. Most orchards were actually privately owned. The trees were grafted and planted by landowners on private estates, and other orchards were planted by the church, in rectory gardens, and in monasteries. So the people in the upper layers of society had their orchards, but there were very few commercial apples for the common people. Costermongers might sell a few apples here and there, but commercial apple production hadn't really started. There would have been apple trees growing from pips in the hedgerows, as Alison has described, the quality variable, some good, some not so good, but this didn't really matter very much because most apples were cooked anyway, which tends to mellow the flavor, and even a poor apple will taste okay after you've cooked it. Another important point is that if you plant a seed, you always get a new variety. Apples don't breed true, so you can't reproduce an apple tree by planting the pips. If you plant the pips, you'll get an apple tree, but the apples will be different from the one you started with. To copy an apple tree properly, you have to clone it, and this is done by a process called grafting. You take a cutting from the tree that you want to copy, and then you splice a tiny part of it onto another tree called a rootstock, or simply called a stock. And the stock supplies the roots. The cutting, or the scion, as we call it, forms the branches and the fruit, and this keeps the variety the same. They did this in Shakespeare's time, and we use the same method today. In fact, all commercial apple trees are constructed from these two parts. Graft, stock, and scion are familiar words used in other contexts, and they do appear throughout Shakespeare's works. Apples were often used as stocks. If you graft a decent apple onto a crab, the tree is actually transformed into something much better. In about 1550, King Henry VIII told his fruit grower to set up some orchards near Tenham in Kent. And these were what you call mother orchards. And a mother orchard is one where the trees are planted mainly to supply cuttings rather than fruit. The idea is you can start more orchards with the same varieties of tree. Richard planted lots of trees. The apples were mainly pippins and renettes, which he got from France. Pippins are good flavored eating apples, and renettes are similar, but they have a rougher skin, and they store for a lot longer. And it seems at that time, France must have been much more advanced in apples than England. There were also cider orchards. I think Americans call cider hard cider, mainly in the southwest of England. And these orchards had been established much earlier, since the Norman conquest, and they became more important as the winters got colder.
So, how about that? I know I didn't realize that apples were genetically different if you planted them from the seeds of an apple rather than grafting the apple into a new apple tree. That makes sense, of course, because it's kind of like the difference between having kids versus cloning, but I just hadn't put that into perspective with apples. What a cool thing to know. If you'd like to hear our complete episode with Nigel and Allison, where they talk about various breeds of apples native to England during Shakespeare's lifetime, what happened to the apples that were brought to the US by English colonists in the 17th century, along with more apple history from Shakespeare's lifetime, then you can listen to our entire interview at CassidyCash.com/episode 284. This podcast is also available anywhere you get your podcasts. If you will subscribe to That Shakespeare Life on iTunes or Apple, I think it's called Apple Podcasts now, Spotify, or anywhere else, then you can find this in the feed. But you can also check out our show notes for more information about Nigel and Allison and their work in Leicestershire. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 284. While you're there, if you want more in-depth visual history like woodcuts and illustrations of apples from the 16th century, as well as some 16th and 17th century recipes that use the apples that we're talking about, then check out the Patreon button on that show notes page, and you can expand some insider history extras related to apples from Shakespeare's lifetime. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.